So in that, our area of the south side, and I think the whole area, there was a curfew put out, like a daytime, daylight curfew, and so, and nobody was allowed on the street at all. It was like summer. It was like, 75 degrees or whatever it was, and a beautiful summer day, and you look out the window and there wasn't one person out on the street in the neighborhood. There wasn't even anybody letting their dog out or anything. And so finally, I don't know, about 6 or 7 o'clock, I got on my skateboard and started going around the neighborhood, and it was just spooky because there was nobody around. And after a while, I got up by that church you were talking about before. That looks like a big tent. Mm-hmm. And I got up by that area, and
Shepherd, I think it's called, our Shepherd Lutheran Church.
Okay.
Greendale, yeah.
Yeah, and there was like 2 or 3 other kids that were walking around or on their bicycles, and we all just came to the corner. We were just all looking at each other, and we were freaked out, We're just kids and stuff. What's going on?
Yeah.
Or why is this? We just don't understand it.
Yeah. and the riots around 67, that happened after what you're talking about, maybe, huh?
Either side of it, I don't remember. Maybe that's why they had the curfew, because it was.
Yeah.
Well, the riots were more related to after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King.
Oh, right. Yes.
And that was, between Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King being assassinated. A lot of people, they look fondly back at the 60s and, all this stuff, but, they don't really want to recall all the assassinations and the Vietnam War and the COINTELPRO secret FBI the entrapment things and of war protesters and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the background of the area I grew up with, but that was also not openly discussed either.
Well, that's the part I remember, the assassinations, and I was young too, and I thought, what kind of a world is this? Everybody's getting shot. Mm-hmm. So, can you name like a specific type of event that really kicked you into high stream activism? Was it the war or injustice?
Well, in high school we had our history class, civic, whatever they call that, civic events.
Civics, yeah.
Yeah, and so I don't know how to put this. Is that teacher, he would have us, stand up and tell what news we had or whatever, and so somebody would get up and say something they read or saw on the TV, and I don't know. I never really, I didn't really participate that much in it, and that teacher didn't like me, and so he was always like, he was putting me in the back of the room all the time and all this stuff, and
maybe you asked too many questions.
Yeah, or not enough, I don't know. But he was one of those guys. There was this whole generation of guys that were World War II vets that had gotten on the GI program, and they didn't really have any particular expertise, so they all became like civics teachers and football coaches and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And so they were pretty straight line, and so they didn't have any, deeper interest in the underlying politics of the world. Mm-hmm. So, that was the generation that, communism and socialism, which they were at that time, were bad things. Mm-hmm. And so I got into a bunch of trouble just trying to have those discussions even. But
do you remember being that age, what you were feeling about your future? Were you really excited about what you were going to turn into or become, or were you starting to worry about the way the world was going?
Well, it was
Probably thinking of girls, I suppose, but
well, all that, yeah. Yeah, it's just kind of, you got all these things in your mind, you don't really know, you know. I mean, some people kind of knew what they wanted to do. I didn't necessarily know, but
did your artwork, was there a place for that in your school where you made a name for yourself with your
well, yeah,
peers?
that's they tried to help me out at least that way. Is they made me the editorial cartoonist on the high school paper. So
Wow.
I guess that could be a start of all that. And they would print some of the, you know, I was at that point. Then I was really personally getting into all the. That's when the Haight-Ashbury hippie stuff was taken off, and all these psychedelic posters were becoming
Oh.
big, and that and then people might or might not remember Zap Comics, those underground comics, that those were coming out like when I was in high school. And so my older brother, who was in college, would buy them for me because you had to be 18.
Wow.
And so that I didn't do very good in that regular art class. Actually, I only got like B minuses and C's. But all my attention went into these underground comics and these posters, and so I started copying those artists as my reference point. You know, in art class, you copy Michelangelo and all that stuff. Well, I copied all those other artists, Robert Crumb and Gerald Shelton and Rick Griffin and those kind of people. And so they had these elaborate posters they did for all the music concerts back then. And so I was developing my own style of that, and then developing my own kind of trying to teach myself how to draw cartoons based on the cartoons in those comic books. And so that made their way into my high school newspaper. I mean, they were cutting me a break, obviously, because it was kind of out there,
I'm sure you were doing them a break. I bet they didn't have anyone else in the school as talented.
Well, nobody else volunteered. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So you didn't have to go into the draft or anything, huh?
Well, that's what I was going to say. Is that those were the years that that young boys were required to go. They would have the
Lottery?
what they call that, the recruiters. The high school would let the military recruiters have an assembly for all the boys who had just turned 17 or 18, and it was a forced requirement. You couldn't just say, no, I don't wanna. And so you had to go to these and listen to their pitch for the military. And this was at the height of the Vietnam War, and people were dying, and every night in the news there was people being killed and bloody and live, carried out, all this stuff. And so, reality started settling in, especially this contrast between this wonderful world of all this posters and comic art, and then the reality of all this death and destruction, and then that's put right in my face that I had required. And I was kind of timid about that, but I always have to hand it to these two guys that were in the class or two ahead of me, two brothers, Doug and Dennis Drake, and we all were at that required assembly one day, and they got up and walked out in protest. And I was too scared to do it, but I always thought that was, so hats off to you, Doug and Dennis Drake. So
maybe that was kind of a start of your feeling you had the power also to
well, it was
make a statement.
It was like, wow, you can do that.
So how did you and your friends your age talk about the war? Did you talk about it much?
Only in the context of what our draft number was, but most of the guys my age were going to go to college.
Oh.
And so at that point, you could go to college and not get drafted. or I knew some guys that if you got married and had a kid and you're like 19, then you didn't have to go either. I knew a few people did that, but that was it was kind of dishonorable because usually they just did it to get out of the draft, and they weren't. It wasn't a meaningful relationship or
Oh.
anything like that.
Yeah.
So, what was the question?
So, were you ever drafted then, or did
Oh
you have
yeah,
to go
well
in?
that was a whole big struggle because, well, to make a long story short, my number came up and I was set to get drafted, and there's a whole long involved story how that did not happen, and it was a big struggle and all like that, but yeah, it was a personal story, and I didn't go to college because I had barely graduated high school. I mean, I had like a D plus C minus average or something like that, and I hated school so much because of some certain teachers I had were, you know, so negative or whatever, and they didn't like me because I was like, obviously I was a hippie, you know. Excuse me.
How would your parents look at you being a hippie or alternative type
Well,
of guy?
it was interesting because, you know, they didn't push me either way, which I always respected them for that. And my dad was a front line combat medic, veteran, and so he had, you know, those pictures you see of people carrying stretchers of dying people off the field. That was him in the war, and he didn't really encourage me to sign up or anything. And in fact, when I was 17, I thought somehow I would get around the worst of it if I joined the Navy. So I asked him to come with me down to the Coast Guard station on the lakefront there, now where Summerfest is now, I believe, or it was a nuclear missile site back then. Do you know that?
No, I did
Yeah,
not
there
know
was a
that. I'm
nuclear
glad I didn't
missile
know
on
it.
Jones Island. There was a nuclear missile
What
site.
the hell? No.
So, anyways, and I went down there, and you know these big beefy tough guys, you know, and they asked, you know, my dad would have to sign off, and so they asked him, "Did you sign off?" And I go, "No." So I don't know why he didn't tell me that ahead of time, but I was, you know, later I was very grateful for it because the next year I was starting to get my number and whatnot, and so a number of things happened in a progression, and I do have a comic book I made of it, uh, which I only got halfway through the story because it was so long and involved. But excuse me. But like I got some pretty humorous stories about that, but I don't know if you got time for that kind of thing.
Maybe at the end of this we'll turn it off and we'll go into some stories.
Yeah. So at any rate, I that those 2 or so years were pretty intense, and I was struggling and went through a lot of changes and all that, and eventually I did not get drafted. The long and short of that whole story. So yeah, so then there I was. I was kind of free and clear in a way, and I didn't really know what to do with myself suddenly because I had spent my last 2 years trying to get out of this, but you know I learned to work with the resources, and there are some really great activist groups in Milwaukee, like the old Rutabaga bookstore, which was on the campus of Marquette on 16th and Wells, and they had a program where it was veterans that would help guys counsel them on getting out of the draft. And so I mean my first approach was to try to be a conscientious objector, and so they were very helpful and kind of gave me suggestions on how to get through all that over the time. So I'll always be forever grateful to them. And so yeah, so there all then I was all of a sudden I had a job on the east side, and I was 20.
So how did you feel when you say conscientious object, or was it more of a moral thing, or you just didn't want to kill people, or?
Well, it's kind of a combination. I didn't really understand the concept of killing people, but I knew it was something that I didn't seem like a good idea to me.
But they were communists, and there was the domino effect.
I didn't buy any of that.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but this was bullshit to me.
They believed if one country went communist, all the surrounding ones would, and before you knew it, they'd be on our doorstep. And
Yeah, somehow that just never rang true to me.
mm-hmm.
And plus, I had already been self-educating myself, and I have to put in there too that oh man, I was like maybe a junior or so in high school that my my oldest brother Bob, the boy, he was working at an ad agency in downtown Milwaukee, but in his off time, he was doing graphic art for Kaleidoscope, the underground newspaper in Milwaukee. And so I just kind of was drawn to that and that kind of thing. And so I actually was hanging out at the Kaleidoscope office, and I met all these different various characters and weirdos and political activists and just all kinds of, completely, totally different than the world that I grew up in. It was just complete. And so I was getting educated on this completely alternative counterculture thinking at that time, and that was my first big breakthrough in getting started in activism, really, because I hung around there long enough, and I was, they were showing me layout and paste up. Back in those days, you cut and pasted words and all that kind of thing, and decades before computers, and so, and I was like hanging out with like guys like Dennis Gall, who was this famous troublemaker who later became a lawyer, but so one day he said to me, well, I want to get a header for a column of music review, but he wanted to be kind of sarcastic, because their view, this kind of music was too capitalistic and whatnot. It wasn't political enough for them, kind of. So they were more into bands like MC5 and the Fugs and all these underground bands. And so I was listening to that kind of music, which most people didn't even know that existed. And so anyway, so they wanted this kind of sarcastic header for this music review column, and it was going to be music, but it was spelled MUZ-IK. And so the cartoon I ended up drawing was like, okay, you've got the guitar player in the classic guitar pose with the guitar, and he's got the frizzy hair, and he's got the big frying pan eyes and all this stuff, except that the guitar was on the floor, and he had a big fire hose penis in his hand that he was holding instead of the guitar.
We have to edit this video.
Okay. And so the day after that appeared printed in that issue of Kaleidoscope, I got called into the office of my vice principal at high school.
Oh, you were still in high school?
I was
during
like
all
a
this?
junior in high school.
Oh boy.
And and this vice principal was had been a Marine Corps drill sergeant. So he was a hard ass guy.
Yeah, this doesn't sound good.
And so he pulled me into his office and he showed me that cartoon, and he says, "Now, Bill, we can't have you going around drawing pictures of guys with their wangers in their hand, can we?" And I said, "I don't know." And at that moment in my mind, I knew I had arrived. I had found my calling.
Well, you got some excitement out of standing up to the big Marine sergeant?
You know,
Make an impact.
making an impact
Yeah.
and making a statement, even though it was not that particularly intellectual.
True.
But it was the context, it was
Yeah.
for a protest counterculture
Yeah.
newspaper, and that's what got me fired up was the context and that I could make an impact with my imagery. And that's like I said, that's when I knew I had arrived. I knew I somehow wanted to do that. I wasn't sure how, but that's what started it.
Oh. It maybe gave you some power or a sense of individuality.
It gave me a power of, well, like one of my other brother's friends used to call me shock value Billy. So it gave me this sense of being able to have an impact by shocking people with this concept, whatever it was, after that, you know. So that's when I started kind of working on stuff that would get people's attentions or shock them or somehow get them to think. And so, I mean, it's pretty crude, but you get the idea.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I've experienced that with some of your cartoons.
Make you want to puke.
No. Well, it wakes you up. You know, I don't know if I could interject here, but a lot of people have this belief that when the vets came home from, Vietnam, they were treated so horribly. Can I ask you what your experience was of that? How did you feel about them, or did you see much mistreatment?
Well, I didn't really start interacting with them much until after I graduated from high school with the returning vets, and that was 1970, already into '69. Because I would meet guys that had come back to Greendale and had been in country and all like that, and it was like a real rude awakening. It was a shock, and they had us all this rage and anger and PTSD and stuff that nobody knew what that was or could say what that was. There was just all this rage and hurt, and then which I didn't do this myself, but a lot of protesters were spitting on them guys when they came back, but some of the World War II veterans were putting them down because they bought into the thing of, oh well, you guys were just over there taking drugs and stuff like that. That's not how it was at all.
Oh, wow.
And the reason that guys did get hooked on drugs is because of as a coping mechanism of dealing with all this killing and suffering, and they could die any minute themselves, and the fact that due to the CIA and the Golden Triangle is that all these drugs were readily available to service people, and so I would meet a lot of guys that would come back. Back then they wouldn't search your duffel bag, so they would come back with 50 pounds of heroin or something and sell it, that kind of thing. But so they were addict, had trauma, and they had no way of dealing with it. And I had enough of them, put me up against the wall and really get in my face, because I was always a smart ass, and so I'd be a little bit smart ass, and they would set me straight right now, So so it was traumatic for everybody, but no, I was never one that bought into that. Oh, you're weak or whatever because you started drugs. I think I inherently understood why they did.
And you had some sympathy for them that they had to be over there?
Well, that, and I was kind of scared, and I was also realizing, well, that's where I'm headed.
Yeah.
And so that was an impetus for me to want to get out of the draft.
As the years went on, did you follow up with, or did you see what happened to those guys that had been over there? Some of
I
them?
would run into or hear what had happened to somebody or something, and but yeah, I know that a lot of them just ended up really troubled, or else they blended back into society, but they had deep PTSD, and it became a lifelong thing. And one or two, this one guy, he actually went on to, what the hell was it? I think he was involved with the CIA or drug cartels in Central America and smuggling drugs from Colombia to the U.S. because of his connections and training in Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it was not all cut and dried.
When they came over, Bill, do you think they were angry at you guys then? I mean, do you think they believed at all in what their mission had been? I know that's a generalizing
Well,
question,
yeah, because
but
everybody was different. And
yeah.
some people, yeah, wanted to beat me up just because I was hippie and not patriotic. And others thought that I was one of those that would be spitting at them, and I wasn't either.
Oh,
So you kind of get it from both sides.
wow. Yeah.
You know, and then plus you get it from World War II veterans.
Yeah. Now, we might broaden this out and just kind of jump through the years since then. Of course, but you've really kept your politics and your interest in things. I suppose you kept educating yourself about how the world was working and
Well, yeah, I just always kind of had, it kind of flowed into kind of the, how can I say it, kind of the counterculture stuff, but it kind of, as the counterculture evolved, then it became, you know, the hippies became the back to the landers and stuff like that.
oh,
And so that started kind of transmogrifying into these different groups too. So some people were, you know, city kids that were going back to the land and trying to get back to the earth and be environmental and all that. And others got into the drug culture and that kind of overlapped with the music culture. And so there was all these different overlappings. And so for a while I was involved with a lot of the entertainment, music culture aspects by doing posters for concerts and bands and bars and so you know, and that kind of thing. So
were you disappointed to see that the counterculture maybe got watered down into the back to the land aspects, and maybe a lot of them got away from politics, or once the war was over they didn't have an investment, maybe?
well, that's a complex question because it was a complex thing, and there's no easy, clear explanation for that because, you know, I understand when you're involved with the music and entertainment and the drug things, there's a lot of ego in that. But with the back to the land, there's like, you know, true concern for the environment and respect for each other. And so they didn't always connect. So yeah, so they did kind of separate, and so the hippie thing kind of dissolved into these different things, and then eventually, it was the late 70s or something, disco kind of killed the whole live music kind of person-to-person, human-made music, you know. And that was kind of all involved with the CIA bringing in all this cocaine to repress protesting and all that stuff, and so a lot
And
of
the
people,
corporations took over the music industry and
Right.
kept out the rebellious elements, I suppose.
exactly, yeah. So there was all those elements, and a lot of people don't believe any of that happened, but believe what you want. I mean,
You
one of my
lived
other
it.
brothers was in a band that had a charting record for a few years, and so I got to see that side of the music industry and the harsh realities of that, and how these kids were just taken advantage of. And
But we got the Bee Gees.
uh,
Uh-oh.
kill me now.
Well, somewhere in here, you also got interested in Indian spirituality. You want to tell us about that?
Well, I think as a result of kind of transformation from that kind of hippie spirituality stuff, because that was the foundation for that originally, was kind of this spiritual aspect of thinking and taking in the universality of things and all like that. And because the 60s brought along all this, opened up the door for all this other activism, so it opened the door for various groups to try and reclaim their own culture and rights and stuff. And so, you know, like the Black Panthers and those movements for black people, there was the Latino groups with Cesar Chavez and the union rights for like the fruit pickers, and then in '72 there was the Wounded Knee uprising, and all of these things, as we learned later, nobody would believe them at the time, but they were all being infiltrated by different FBI and CIA people to try and you know, suppress these movements. And so there was all this stuff going on, and so I was trying to learn from this, and most people they didn't know anything about that. You know, for the most part, you know, they're going to college to become accountants or some damn thing. You know.
Do you think that started with Nixon? A lot of that COINTELPRO, where the
Oh,
FBI
definitely.
was spying on you, or did it even
Absolutely.
happen before Nixon?
Well, I think that I don't know if that aspect. I don't know if LBJ was directly involved in it. I don't know enough about that aspect, but it certainly started picking up then, because you know J. Edgar Hoover was still head of the FBI in those years. He was
Right.
still alive.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, it totally picked up with Nixon and all those COINTELPRO, and then there was the ATF and all that stuff, and so yeah, and so yeah, and then being involved in kind of the drug aspect of thing, you know, I would interact with people who were drug smugglers and dealers and stuff, and find out different aspects of you know, what they knew, or you know, in a political context.